Chapter 20, Conversion of Constantine. Part 1. The motives, progress, and effects of the conversion of Constantine. Legal establishment and constitution of the Christian or Catholic Church. The public establishment of Christianity may be considered as one of those important and domestic revolutions which excite the most lively curiosity and afford the most valuable instruction. The victories in the civil policy of Constantine no longer influence the state of Europe, but a considerable portion of the globe still retains the impression which it received from the conversion of that monarch, and the ecclesiastical institutions of his reign are still connected, by an indissoluble chain, with the opinions, the passions, and the interests of the present generation. In the consideration of a subject which may be examined with impartiality, but cannot be viewed with indifference, a difficulty immediately arises of a very unexpected nature, that of ascertaining the real and precise date of the conversion of Constantine. The eloquent Lactantius, in the midst of his court, seems impatient one to proclaim to the world the glorious example of the sovereign of Gaul, who, in the first moments of his reign, acknowledged and adored the majesty of the true and only God. 2. The learned Eusebius has ascribed the faith of Constantine to the miraculous sign which was displayed in the heavens whilst he meditated and prepared the Italian expedition. 3. The historian Zosimus maliciously asserts that the emperor had imbrued his hands in the blood of his eldest son before he publicly renounced the gods of Rome and of his ancestors. 4. The perplexity produced by these discordant authorities in the midst of his court chapters. According to the strictness of ecclesiastical language, the first of the Christian emperors was unworthy of that name, till the moment of his death, since it was only during his last illness that he received, as a catechumen, the imposition of hands, 5, and was afterwards admitted, by the initiatory rites of baptism, into the number of the faithful. 6. The Christianity of Constantine must be allowed in a much more vague and qualified sense, and the nicest accuracy is required in tracing the slow and almost imperceptible gradations by which the monarch declared himself the protector and at length the proselyte of the Church. It was an arduous task to eradicate the habits and prejudices of his education, to acknowledge the divine power of Christ, and to understand that the truth of his revelation was incompatible with the worship of the gods. The obstacles which he had probably experienced in his own mind instructed him to proceed with caution in the momentous change of a national religion, and he insensibly discovered his new opinions as far as he could enforce them with safety and with effect. During the whole course of his reign, the stream of Christianity flowed with a gentle though accelerated motion, but its general direction was sometimes checked and sometimes diverted by the accidental circumstances of the times and by the prudence or possibly by the caprice of the monarch. His ministers were permitted to signify the intentions of their master in the various language which was best adapted to their respective principles. 7. And he artfully balanced the hopes and fears of his subjects by publishing in the same year 2 edicts, the first of which enjoined the solemn observance of Sunday 8, and the second directed the regular consultation of the aruspices. 9. While this important revolution yet remained in suspense, the Christians and the pagans watched the conduct of their sovereign with the same anxiety, but with very opposite sentiments. The former were prompted by every motive of zeal as well as vanity to exaggerate the marks of his favor and the evidences of his faith. The latter, till their just apprehensions were changed into despair and resentment, attempted to conceal from the world and from themselves that the gods of Rome could no longer reckon the emperor in the number of their votaries. The same passions and prejudices have engaged the partial writers of the times to connect the public profession of Christianity with the most glorious or the most ignominious era of the reign of Constantine. Mun return. The date of the divine institutions of Lactantius has been accurately discussed, difficulties have been started, solutions proposed, and an expedient imagined of 2 original editions, the former published during the persecution of Diocletian, the latter under that of Licinius. C. du Fresnoy, Préfet, P.V. Tillemont, Mem. Ecclesiast, Tom. 6, p. 465-47 Dal. Lardner's Credibility, Part 2, Volume 7, p. 78, 86. For my own part, I am almost convinced that Lactantius dedicated his institutions to the sovereign of Gaul at a time when Galerius, Maximin, and even Licinius persecuted the Christians, that is, between the years 36 and 31 return. Lactant, Divin. Instit. I. Lev V. 27. The first and most important of these passages is indeed wanting in 28 manuscripts, but it is found in 19. If we weigh the comparative value of these manuscripts of the 6th Prontes library may be alleged in its favor, but the passage is omitted in the correct manuscript of Bologna, which the P. de Montfaucon ascribes to the 6th or 7th century Diarium Italic, p. 489. The taste of most of the editors except Isias C. Lacton, edit. Du Fresnoy, tom. IP 59-6 has felt the genuine style of Lactantius, to 5 return. That rite was always used in making a catechumen, see Bingham's Antiquities, LXCC IP 409, Dom Schaden Hist des Sacramentsdom, AB 6-4, and 6 Dauned, Wesev E. Invitonstant, LF4C 61, immediately before his baptism and death. From the connection of these two facts, Valesius ad locum, Euseb asarcum, E6 das neniaid inbitidon, E6 das neniazarcum, E6 da lidith, invitor forn. Constant L4C 61-63. The legend of Constantine's baptism at Rome 13 years before his death was invented in the 8th century as a proper motive for his donation. Such has been the gradual progress of knowledge that a story, of which Cardinal Baronius Annual Ecclesiast, AD 3249 Ecclesiast and Tondra 24, number 4349 declared himself the unblushing advocate, is now feebly supported even within the verge of the Vatican. See the Antiquita 32, a work published with 6 approbations at Rome in the year 1751 by Father Mamachi, a learned Dominican. The 7th return to the questor or secretary who composed the law of the Theodosian Code makes his master say with indifference, hominibus supradicti religionis it L exvi, tit it elpind. The minister of ecclesiastical affairs was allowed a more devout and respectful style. Min return condrad. Godefroy, in the character of a commentator, endeavors to excuse Constantine, but the more zealous Baronius Annal, Eccles, 8321, number 17, censures his profane conduct with truth and asperity. Whatever symptoms of Christian piety might transpire in the discourses or actions of Constantine, he persevered till he was near 40 years of age in the practice of the established religion. 10. And the same conduct which in the court of Nicomedia might be imputed to his fear could be ascribed only to the inclination or policy of the sovereign of Gaul. His liberality restored and enriched the temples of the gods. The medals which issued from his imperial mint are impressed with the figures and attributes of Jupiter and Apollo, of Mars and Hercules, and his filial piety increased the council of Olympus by the solemn apotheosis of his father Constantius. 11. But the devotion of Constantine was more peculiarly directed to the genius of the sun, the Apollo of Greek and Roman mythology, and he was pleased to be represented with the symbols of the god of light and poetry. The unerring shafts of that deity, the brightness of his eyes, his laurel wreath, immortal beauty, and elegant accomplishments seemed to point him out as the patron of a young hero. The altars of Apollo were crowned with the votive offerings of Constantine, and the credulous multitude were taught to believe that the emperor was permitted to behold with mortal eyes the visible majesty of their tutelar deity, and that, either walking or in a vision, he was blessed with the auspicious omens of a long and victorious reign. The sun was universally celebrated as the invincible guide and protector of Constantine, and the pagans might reasonably expect that the insulted god would pursue with unrelenting vengeance the impiety of his ungrateful favorite. 12:10 Return, Theodoret. Lic 18 seems to insinuate that Helena gave her son a Christian education, but we may be assured from the superior authority of Eusebius in Viti, Constant, L3 C47, that she herself was indebted to Constantine for the knowledge of Christianity. 11 Return, see the medals of Constantine in Ducange and Banduri. As few cities had retained the privilege of coining, almost all the medals of that age issued from the mint under the sanction of the imperial authority. 12 Return, the panegyric of Eumenius 7T, Vet, which was pronounced a few months before the Italian War, abounds with the most unexceptionable evidence of the pagan superstition of Constantine and of his particular veneration for Apollo, or the sun, to which Julian alludes. As long as Constantine exercised a limited sovereignty over the provinces of Gaul, his Christian subjects were protected by the authority and perhaps by the laws of a prince who wisely left to the gods the care of vindicating their own honor. If we may credit the assertion of Constantine himself, he had been an indignant spectator of the savage cruelties which were inflicted by the hands of Roman soldiers on those citizens whose religion was their only crime. 13. In the East and in the West, he had seen the different effects of severity and indulgence, and as the former was rendered still more odious by the example of Galerius, his implacable enemy, the latter was recommended to his imitation by the authority and advice of a dying father. The son of Constantius immediately suspended or repealed the edicts of persecution and granted the free exercise of their religious ceremonies to all those who had already professed themselves members of the church. They were soon encouraged to depend on the favor as well as on the justice of their sovereign, who had imbibed a secret and sincere reverence for the name of Christ and for the God of the Christians. 1413 Return. Constantine. Orat point. Ad Sanctos, c. 25. But it might easily be shown that the Greek translator has improved the sense of the Latin original, and the aged emperor might recollect the persecution of Diocletian with a more lively abhorrence than he had actually felt to the days of his youth in paganism. 14 Return to C. Euseb. Hist. Eccles. L8 13 L99 and in Wittkonst. Li. Sickles. Sickos de mort. Persecut. Sicut. 25. About 5 months after the conquest of Italy, the emperor made a solemn and authentic declaration of his sentiments by the celebrated Edict of Milan, which restored peace to the Catholic Church. In the personal interview of the two Western princes, Constantine, by the ascendant of genius and power, obtained the ready concurrence of his colleague Licinius. The union of their names and authority disarmed the fury of Maximin, and after the death of the tyrant of the East, the Edict of Milan was received as a general and fundamental law of the Roman world. 1515 Return. Caecilius de mort. Persecute. C. 48 has preserved the Latin original, and Eusebius Hist. Echelus. C. 5 has given a Greek translation of this perpetual edict, which refers to some provisional regulations more justly deprived of the restitution of all the civil and religious rights of which the Christians had won the purse. It was enacted that the places of worship and public lands, which had been confiscated, should be restored to the Church without dispute, without delay, and without expense, and this severe injunction was accompanied with a gracious promise that if any of the purchasers had paid a fair and adequate price, they should be indemnified from the imperial treasury. The salutary regulations which guard the future tranquility of the faithful are framed on the principles of enlarged and equal toleration, and such an equality must have been interpreted by a recent sect as an advantageous and honorable distinction. The two emperors proclaim to the world that they have granted a free and absolute power to the Christians and to all others of following the religion which each individual thinks proper to prefer, to which he has addicted his mind, and which he may deem the best adapted to his own use. They carefully explain every ambiguous word, remove every exception, and exact from the governors of the provinces a strict obedience to the true and simple meaning of an edict, which was designed to establish and secure, without any limitation, the claims of religious liberty. They condescend to assign two weighty reasons which have induced them to allow this universal toleration: the humane intention of consulting the peace and happiness of their people, and the pious hope that, by such a conduct, they shall appease and propitiate the Deity whose seat is in heaven. They gratefully acknowledge the many signal proofs which they have received of the divine favor, and they trust that the same providence will forever continue to protect the prosperity of the prince and people. From these vague and indefinite expressions of piety, 3 suppositions may be deduced, of a different, but not of an incompatible nature. The mind of Constantine might fluctuate between the pagan and the Christian religions. According to the loose and complying notions of polytheism, he might acknowledge the God of the Christians as one of the many deities who compose the hierarchy of heaven, or perhaps he might embrace the philosophic and pleasing idea that, notwithstanding the variety of names, of rites, and of opinions, all the sects and all the nations of mankind are united in the worship of the common Father and Creator of the universe. 16. Return. A panegyric of Constantine, pronounced 7 or 8 months after the Edict of Milan. See Gothofred, Chronologue, Legum P. 7 and Tillemont, Hist. des Empereurs Tom. EVP 246 uses the following remarkable expression: Summe rerum sator, quod linguas gentium esse voluisti, quem enim te ici, messim perster. Verus, messim pasteur. 971c is ingenious, subtle, prolix, but the counsels of princes are more frequently influenced by views of temporal advantage than by considerations of abstract and speculative truth. The partial and increasing favor of Constantine may naturally be referred to the esteem which he entertained for the moral character of the Christians, and to a persuasion that the propagation of the gospel would inculcate the practice of private and public virtue. Whatever latitude an absolute monarch may assume in his own conduct, whatever indulgence he may claim for his own passions, it is undoubtedly his interest that all his subjects should respect the natural and civil obligations of society. But the operation of the wisest laws is imperfect and precarious. They seldom inspire virtue, they cannot always restrain vice. Their power is insufficient to prohibit all that they condemn, nor can they always punish the actions which they prohibit. The legislators of antiquity had summoned to their aid the powers of education and of opinion. But every principle which had once maintained the vigor and purity of Rome and Sparta was long since extinguished in a declining and despotic empire. Philosophy still exercised her temperate sway over the human mind, but the cause of virtue derived very feeble support from the influence of the pagan superstition. Under these discouraging circumstances, a prudent magistrate might observe with pleasure the progress of a religion which diffused among the people a pure, benevolent, and universal system of ethics, adapted to every duty and every condition of life, recommended as the will and reason of the supreme deity, and enforced by the sanction of eternal rewards or punishments. The experience of Greek and Roman history could not inform the world how far the system of national manners might be reformed and improved by the precepts of a divine revelation, and Constantine might listen with some confidence to the flattering and indeed reasonable assurances of Lactantius. The eloquent apologist seemed firmly to expect, and almost ventured to promise, that the establishment of Christianity would restore the innocence and felicity of the primitive age, that the worship of the true God would extinguish war and dissension among those who mutually considered themselves as the children of a common parent, that every impure desire, every angry or selfish passion would be restrained by the knowledge of the gospel, and that the magistrates might sheath the sword of justice among a people who would be universally actuated by the sentiments of truth and piety, of equity and moderation, of harmony and universal love. 1717 Return. See the elegant description of Lactantius, Divine Institute, v8, who is much more perspicuous and positive than becomes a discreet prophet. The passive and unresisting obedience which bows under the yoke of authority, or even of oppression, must have appeared, in the eyes of an absolute monarch, the most conspicuous and useful of the evangelic virtues. 18. The primitive Christians derived the institution of civil government, not from the consent of the people, but from the decrees of heaven. The reigning emperor, though he had usurped the scepter by treason and murder, immediately assumed the sacred character of vicegerent of the deity. To the deity alone he was accountable for the abuse of his power, and his subjects were indissolubly bound, by their oath of fidelity, to a tyrant who had violated every law of nature and society. The humble Christians were sent into the world as sheep among wolves, and since they were not permitted to employ force even in the defense of their religion, they should be still more criminal if they were tempted to shed the blood of their fellow creatures in disputing the vain privileges or the sordid possessions of this transitory life. Faithful to the doctrine of the apostle, who in the reign of Nero had preached the duty of unconditional submission, the Christians of the 3 first centuries preserved their conscience pure and innocent of the guilt of secret conspiracy or open rebellion. While they experienced the rigor of persecution, they were never provoked either to meet their tyrants in the field or indignantly to withdraw themselves into some remote and sequestered corner of the globe. 19. The Protestants of France, of Germany, and of Britain, who asserted with such intrepid courage their civil and religious freedom, have been insulted by the invidious comparison between the conduct of the primitive and of the reformed Christians. 20. Perhaps instead of censure, some applause may be due to the superior sense and spirit of our ancestors, who had convinced themselves that religion cannot abolish the unalienable rights of human nature. 21. Perhaps the patience of the primitive church may be ascribed to its weakness as well as to its virtue. A sect of unwarlike plebeians without leaders, without arms, without fortifications, must have encountered inevitable destruction in a rash and fruitless resistance to the master of the Roman legions. But the Christians, when they deprecated the wrath of Diocletian or solicited the favor of Constantine, could allege with truth and confidence that they held the principle of passive obedience, and that in the space of 3 centuries their conduct had always been conformable to their principles. They might add that the throne of the emperors would be established on a fixed and permanent basis if all their subjects, embracing the Christian doctrine, should learn to suffer and to obey. 18. Return. The political system of the Christians is explained by Grotius de Jure Bellia Passis, LIC 3:4. Grotius was a republican and an exile, but the mildness of his temper inclined him to support the established powers. To a 19. Return, Tertullian, 434, 34 und Christiani, embeniri potuerunt Christiani, ad scapulam. If this assertion be strictly true, it excludes the Christians of that age from all civil and military employments, which would have compelled them to take an active part in the service of their respective governors. See Moyle's works, Volume 9, 20. Return. See The Artful Bossuet, Hist. des Variations des Eglises Protestantes, Tom. E.I. p. 220-225-8, and The Malicious Bale, Tom 2, p. 820. I name Bale, for he was certainly the author of the Avis aux Refuges. Consult the Dictionnaire critique de Chauffier, Tom. E. Part 2, p. 1. Return. Traternity Buchanan is the earliest, or at least the most celebrated, of the reformers, who has justified the theory of resistance. See his Dialogue de Jure Regni apud Scotos, Tom. 2, p. 28-30, edit. Follow. Ruderman. Considered as the ministers of heaven, appointed to rule or to chastise the nations of the earth. But sacred history affords many illustrious examples of the more immediate interposition of the deity in the government of his chosen people. The scepter and the sword were committed to the hands of Moses, of Joshua, of Gideon, of David, of the Maccabees. The virtues of those heroes were the motive or the effect of the divine favor. The success of their arms was destined to achieve the deliverance or the triumph of the church. If the judges of Israel were occasional and temporary magistrates, the kings of Judah derived from the royal unction of their great ancestor an hereditary and indefeasible right, which could not be forfeited by their own vices, nor recalled by the caprice of their subjects. The same extraordinary providence, which was no longer confined to the Jewish people, might elect Constantine and his family as the protectors of the Christian world, and the devout Lactantius announces in a prophetic tone, 22. Galerius and Maximin, Maxentius and Licinius were the rivals who shared with the favorites of heaven the provinces of the empire. The tragic deaths of Galerius and Maximin soon gratified the resentment and fulfilled the sanguine expectations of the Christians. The success of Constantine against Maxentius and Licinius removed the 2 formidable competitors who still opposed the triumph of the second David, and his cause might seem to claim the peculiar interposition of Providence. The character of the Roman tyrant disgraced the purple in human nature, and though the Christians might enjoy his precarious favor, they were exposed, with the rest of his subjects, to the effects of his wanton and capricious cruelty. The conduct of Licinius soon betrayed the reluctance with which he had consented to the wise and humane regulations of the Edict of Milan. The convocation of provincial synods was prohibited in his dominions, his Christian officers were ignominiously dismissed, and if he avoided the guilt, or rather danger, of a general persecution, his partial oppressions were rendered still more odious by the violation of a solemn and voluntary engagement. 23. While the East, according to the lively expression of Eusebius, was involved in the shades of infernal darkness, the auspicious rays of celestial light warmed and illuminated the provinces of the West. The piety of Constantine was admitted as an unexceptionable proof of the justice of his arms, and his use of victory confirmed the opinion of the Christians that their hero was inspired and conducted by the Lord of hosts. The conquest of Italy produced a general edict of toleration, and as soon as the defeat of Licinius had invested Constantine with the sole dominion of the Roman world, he immediately, by circular letters, exhorted all his subjects to imitate, without delay, the example of their sovereign and to embrace the divine truth of Christianity. 24-22. Return. L'acton divin. Institut. I.L. Eusebius, in the course of his history, his life, and his oration, repeatedly inculcates the divine right of Constantine to the empire. 23. Return. Our imperfect knowledge of the persecution of Licinius is derived from Eusebius, Hist. LXC 8, Veit, Constantine LIC 4956, L2C 12 Aurelius. Victor mentions his cruelty in general term of Constantine. Pont2C. The assurance that the elevation of Constantine was intimately connected with the designs of providence, instilled into the minds of the Christians. Two opinions which, by very different means, assisted the accomplishment of the prophecy. Their warm and active loyalty exhausted in his favor every resource of human industry, and they confidently expected that their strenuous efforts would be seconded by some divine and miraculous aid. The enemies of Constantine have imputed to interested motives the alliance which he insensibly contracted with the Catholic Church, and which apparently contributed to the success of his ambition. In the beginning of the 4th century, the Christians still bore a very inadequate proportion to the inhabitants of the empire, but among a degenerate people who viewed the change of masters with the indifference of slaves, the spirit and union of a religious party might assist the popular leader, to whose service, from a principle of conscience, they had devoted their lives and fortunes. 25. The example of his father had instructed Constantine to esteem and to reward the merit of the Christians. And in the distribution of public offices he had the advantage of strengthening his government by the choice of ministers or generals in whose fidelity he could repose a just and unreserved confidence. By the influence of these dignified missionaries, the proselytes of the new faith must have multiplied in the court and army. The barbarians of Germany, who filled the ranks of the legions, were of a careless temper, which acquiesced without resistance in the religion of their commander, and when they passed the Alps it may fairly be presumed that a great number of the soldiers had already consecrated their swords to the service of Christ and of Constantine. 26. The habits of mankind and the interests of religion gradually abated the horror of war and bloodshed, which had so long prevailed among the Christians, and in the councils which were assembled under the gracious protection of Constantine, the authority of the bishops was seasonably employed to ratify the obligation of the military oath, and to inflict the penalty of excommunication on those soldiers who threw away their arms during the peace of the Church. 27. While Constantine, in his own dominions, increased the number and zeal of his faithful adherents, he could depend on the support of a powerful faction in those provinces which were still possessed or usurped by his rivals. A secret disaffection was diffused among the Christian subjects of Maxentius and Licinius, and the resentment, which the latter did not attempt to conceal, served only to engage them still more deeply in the interest of his competitor. The regular correspondence which connected the bishops of the most distant provinces enabled them freely to communicate their wishes and their designs, and to transmit without danger any useful intelligence or any pious contributions which might promote the service of Constantine, who publicly declared that he had taken up arms for the deliverance of the Church. 28-25 Return. In the beginning of the last century, the Papists of England were only a 30th, and the Protestants of France only a 15th part of the respective nations, to whom their spirit and power were a constant object of apprehension. See the relations which Bentivoglio, who was then nuncio at Brussels and afterwards cardinal, transmitted to the court of Rome, Relazione, Tom. 2p. 211-2041. Bentivoglio was curious, well-informed, but somewhat partial. 26 Return. This careless temper of the Germans appears almost uniformly on the history of the conversion of each of the tribes. The legions of Constantine were recruited with Germans, as Zosimus L2p 86, and the court even of his father had been filled with Christians. See the first book of the life of Constantine by Eusebius. 27. I is height, canon. I kai. The best critics apply these words to the peace of the Church. 128 Return. Eusebius always considers the Second Civil War against Licinius as a sort of religious crusade. At the invitation of the tyrant, some Christian officers had resumed their zones, or, in other words, had returned to the military service. Their conduct was afterwards censured by the 12th canon of the Council of Nice, if this particular application may be received, instead of the lose and general sense of the Greek interpreters, Balsamor Zonaras and Alexis Aristinus. See Beveridge Pandect, Eccles, Greek, Tom, IP, 72, Tom. 2p. 73, annotation. The enthusiasm which inspired the troops, and perhaps the emperor himself, had sharpened their swords while it satisfied their conscience. They marched to battle with the full assurance that the same God, who had formerly opened a passage to the Israelites through the waters of Jordan and had thrown down the walls of Jericho at the sound of the trumpets of Joshua, would display his visible majesty and power in the victory of Constantine. The evidence of ecclesiastical history is prepared to affirm that their expectations were justified by the conspicuous miracle to which the conversion of the first Christian emperor has been almost unanimously ascribed. The real or imaginary cause of so important an event deserves and demands the attention of posterity, and I shall endeavor to form a just estimate of the famous vision of Constantine by a distinct consideration of the standard, the dream, and the celestial sign, by separating the historical, the natural, and the marvelous parts of this extraordinary story, which, in the composition of a specious argument, have been artfully confounded in one splendid and brittle mass. An instrument of the tortures which were inflicted only on slaves and strangers became an object of horror in the eyes of a Roman citizen, and the ideas of guilt, of pain, and of ignominy were closely united with the idea of the cross. 29. The piety rather than the humanity of Constantine soon abolished in his dominions the punishment which the Saviour of mankind had condescended to suffer. 30. But the emperor had already learned to despise the prejudices of his education and of his people, before he could erect in the midst of Rome his own statue, bearing a cross in its right hand, with an inscription which referred the victory of his arms and the deliverance of Rome to the virtue of that salutary sign, the true symbol of force and courage. 31. The same symbol sanctified the arms of the soldiers of Constantine. The cross glittered on their helmet, was engraved on their shields, was interwoven into their banners, and the consecrated emblems which adorned the person of the emperor himself were distinguished only by richer materials and more exquisite workmanship. 32. But the principal standard which displayed the triumph of the cross was styled the labarum. 33, an obscure though celebrated name, which has been vainly derived from almost all the languages of the world. It is described 34 as a long pike intersected by a transversal beam. The silken veil which hung down from the beam was curiously inwrought with the images of the reigning monarch and his children. The summit of the pike supported a crown of gold which enclosed the mysterious monogram, at once expressive of the figure of the cross and the initial letters of the name of Christ. 35. The safety of the labarum was entrusted to 50 guards of approved valor and fidelity. Their station was marked by honors and emoluments, and some fortunate accidents soon introduced an opinion that as long as the guards of the labarum were engaged in the execution of their office, they were secure and invulnerable amidst the darts of the enemy. In the Second Civil War, Licinius felt and dreaded the power of this consecrated banner, the sight of which, in the distress of battle, animated the soldiers of Constantine with an invincible enthusiasm, and scattered terror and dismay through the ranks of the adverse legions. 36. The Christian emperors, who respected the example of Constantine, displayed in all their military expeditions the standard of the cross. But when the degenerate successors of Theodosius had ceased to appear in person at the head of their armies, the labarum was deposited as a venerable but useless relic in the palace of Constantinople. 37. Its honors are still preserved on the medals of the Flavian family. Their grateful devotion has placed the monogram of Christ in the midst of the ensigns of Rome. The solemn epithets of safety of the Republic, glory of the army, restoration of public happiness are equally applied to the religious and military trophies, and there is still extant a medal of the Emperor Constantius, where the standard of the labarum is accompanied with these memorable words, "By this sign thou shalt conquer." 38:29. Returna nomen ipsum crucurs absit non modo, e corpore civium Romano rum, sid etiam accogitatiane oculis auribus. c. 5. The Christian writers Justin, Minucius Felix, Tertullian, Jerome, and Maximus of Turin have investigated with tolerable success the figure or likeness of a cross in almost every object of nature or art, in the intersection of the meridian and equator, the human face, a bird flying, a man swimming, a Manston yard, a plough, as one of the examples, in Stinis Pitatu, who considers this law as one of the examples of Constantine's piety. An edict so honorable to Christianity deserved a place in the Theodosian Code, instead of the indirect mention of it which seems to result from the comparison of the 5th and 18th titles of the 9th book. 3.1 Return Eusebius in VT. Constantine, LIC 40. This statue, or at least the cross and inscription, may be ascribed with more probability to the second or even third visit of Constantine to Rome. Immediately after the defeat of Maxentius, the minds of the Senate and people were scarcely ripe for this public monument. Tritiu return vicuna libens mea signa nesiest dii in cibus effigies crucis argemata refuget or longis solido ex oro prefertur in hastis. Hoc signo invictus transmissis alpibus ultor sorvitium sorvit miserabile Constantinu, Christus soretium insignia Christus scripserati, abat summis scrips addita Christis, prudent. 464, 486, with 6444 lead return, tound, the derivation and meaning of the word laborum, which is employed by Gregory Nazianzen, Ambrose, Prudentius, and C., still remain totally unknown, in spite of the efforts of the critics, who have ineffectually tortured the Latin, Greek, Spanish, Celtic, Teutonic, Illyric, Armenian, and C., in search of an etymology. See Ducange in Gloss, Med. et Infim. Latinitat, sub voce, laborum, and Godefroy, ad cod. Theodos, Tom PC. 35 returned a transversias literae notat, Christumin scutis notat. Caecilius, de Mepc. 44. Cooper, A. ad MPC. 44. 40C Andred Bavor, Nober 24. 40C 1WC, Nober 25 have inviti 20C. CZZC, Afgaren Graphy 6 DTC 406025 40CE 6. He introduces the laborum before the Italian expedition, but his narrative seems to indicate that it was never shown at the head of an army till Constantine, above 10 years afterwards, declared himself the enemy of Licinius and the deliverer of the church. 37 Return, C. Cod. Theod, L. 6 Tit. 25. Sozomen, LIC 2. Theophan, Chronograph, P. 11. Theophanes lived towards the end of the 8th century, almost 500 years after Constantine. The modern Greeks were not inclined to display in the field the standard of the empire and of Christianity, and though they depended on every superstitious hope of defenses, the promise of victory would have appeared too bold a fiction. Chi 38 to return. The Abbé de Voisine, p. 1023 and c. alleges several of these medals, and quotes a particular dissertation of a Jesuit, the Père de Grainville, on this subject. In all occasions of danger and distress, it was the practice of the primitive Christians to fortify their minds and bodies by the sign of the cross, which they used, in all their ecclesiastical rites, in all the daily occurrences of life, as an infallible preservative against every species of spiritual or temporal evil. 39. The authority of the Church might alone have had sufficient weight to justify the devotion of Constantine, who in the same prudent and gradual progress acknowledged the truth and assumed the symbol of Christianity. But the testimony of a contemporary writer, who in a formal treatise has avenged the cause of religion, bestows on the piety of the emperor a more awful and sublime character. He affirms with the most perfect confidence that in the night which preceded the last battle against Maxentius, Constantine was admonished in a dream 39 hours to inscribe the shields of his soldiers with the celestial sign of God, the sacred monogram of the name of Christ, that he executed the commands of heaven, and that his valor and obedience were rewarded by the decisive victory of the Milvian Bridge. Some considerations might perhaps incline a skeptical mind to suspect the judgment or the veracity of the rhetorician, whose pen, either from zeal or interest, was devoted to the cause of the prevailing faction. 40. He appears to have published his Deaths of the Persecutors at Nicomedia about 3 years after the Roman victory, but the interval of 1,000 miles and 1,000 days will allow an ample latitude for the invention of declaimers, the credulity of party, and the tacit approbation of the emperor himself, who might listen without indignation to a marvelous tale which exalted his fame and promoted his designs. In favor of Licinius, who still dissembled his animosity to the Christians, the same author has provided a similar vision of a form of prayer which was communicated by an angel and repeated by the whole army before they engaged the legions of the tyrant Maximin. The frequent repetition of miracles serves to provoke where it does not subdue the reason of mankind. 41. But if the dream of Constantine is separately considered, it may be naturally explained either by the policy or the enthusiasm of the emperor himself. Whilst his anxiety for the approaching day which must decide the fate of the empire was suspended by a short and interrupted slumber, the venerable form of Christ and the well-known symbol of his religion might forcibly offer themselves to the active fancy of a prince who reverenced the name and had perhaps secretly implored the power of the God of the Christians. As readily might a consummate statesman indulge himself in the use of one of those military stratagems, one of those pious frauds, which Philip and Sertorius had employed with such art and effect. 42. The preternatural origin of dreams was universally admitted by the nations of antiquity, and a considerable part of the Gallic army was already prepared to place their confidence in the salutary sign of the Christian religion. The secret vision of Constantine could be disproved only by the event, and the intrepid hero who had passed the Alps and the Apennine might view with careless despair the consequences of a defeat under the walls of Rome. The Senate and people, exulting in their own deliverance from an odious tyrant, acknowledged that the victory of Constantine surpassed the powers of man, without daring to insinuate that it had been obtained by the protection of the gods. The triumphal arch, which was erected about 3 years after the event, proclaims, in ambiguous language, that by the greatness of his own mind, and by an instinct or impulse of the divinity, he had saved and avenged the Roman Republic. 43. The pagan orator, who had seized an earlier opportunity of celebrating the virtues of the conqueror, supposes that he alone enjoyed a secret and intimate commerce with the Supreme Being, who delegated the care of mortals to his subordinate deities, and thus assigns a very plausible reason why the subjects of Constantine should not presume to embrace the new religion of their sovereign. 4439. Return to Tertullian de Corona, c. 3, Athanasius, Tom, IP 21. The learned Jesuit, Petavius Dogmata Theolog, LXV, c. 910, has collected many similar passages on the virtues of the cross, which in the last age embarrassed our Protestant disputants. 29. A return, Manso has observed that Gibbon ought not to have separated the vision of Constantine from the wonderful apparition in the sky, as the two wonders are closely connected in Eusebius, Manso Leben Constantine, p. 82, 44. It is certain that this historical declamation was composed and published while Licinius, sovereign of the East, still preserved the friendship of Constantine and of the Christians. Every reader of taste must perceive that the style is of a very different and inferior character to that of Lactantius, and such indeed is the judgment of Leclerc and Lardner, Bibliothèque ancienne et moderne, tom. 3 p. 438. Credibility of the Gospel, and see Part 2, Volume 7. p. 94, 3 arguments from the title of the book and from the names of Donatus and Cecilius are produced by the advocates for Lactantius. See the p. Lestock, tom. 2, p. 4660. Each of these proofs is singly weak and defective, but their concurrence has great weight. I have often fluctuated, and shall colomer follow the Covermizin, calling the author, whoever he was, Coficial. The Tenure 9 by Voltaire, Forcisif, Amziz. Chu ascribes to the success of Constantine the superior fame of his labarum above the angel of Licinius. Yet even this angel is favorably entertained by Pagis, Tillemont, Fleury, and C., who are fond of increasing their stock of miracles. To 42. Return. Besides these well-known examples, Tullius, preface to Boileau's translation of Longinus, has discovered a vision of Antigonus, who assured his troops that he had seen a pentagon, the symbol of safety, with these words, "In this conquer." But Tullius has most inexcusably omitted to produce his authority, and his own character, literary as well as moral, is not free from reproach. See Chaufepier, Dictionnaire critique, tom. 4, p. 460. Without insisting on the silence of Diodorus Plutarch, Justin, and C., it may be observed that Polyaenus, who in a separate chapter E.L. Mol. 6 has collected 19 military stratagems of Antigonus, is totally ignorant of this remarkable vision. 43 return. Instinctu divinitatis, mentis magnitudine. The inscription on the triumphal arch of Constantine, which has been copied by Baronius, Gruter, and C., may still be perused by every curious traveller. 44 return. Habes profecto aliquid cum illa mente divina secretum, quae delegata nostra, diis minoribus cura unice tibi dignatur ostendere panegir. Vete. 923. The philosopher who with calm suspicion examines the dreams and omens, the miracles and prodigies of profane or even of ecclesiastical history, will probably conclude that if the eyes of the spectators have sometimes been deceived by fraud, the understanding of the readers has much more frequently been insulted by fiction. Every event or appearance or accident which seems to deviate from the ordinary course of nature has been rashly ascribed to the immediate action of the deity, and the astonished fancy of the multitude has sometimes given shape and color, language and motion to the fleeting but uncommon meteors of the air. 45 Nazarius and Eusebius are the two most celebrated orators who, in studied panegyrics, have labored to exalt the glory of Constantine. 9 years after the Roman victory, Nazarius 46 describes an army of divine warriors who seem to fall from the sky. He marks their beauty, their spirit, their gigantic forms, the stream of light which beamed from their celestial armor, their patience in suffering themselves to be heard, as well as seen, by mortals, and a declaration that they were sent, that they flew, to the assistance of the great Constantine. For the truth of this prodigy, the pagan orator appeals to the whole Gallic nation, in whose presence he was then speaking, and seems to hope that the ancient apparitions 47 would now obtain credit from this recent and public event. The Christian fable of Eusebius, which, in the space of 26 years, might arise from the original dream, is cast in a much more correct and elegant mold. In one of the marches of Constantine, he is reported to have seen with his own eyes the luminous trophy of the cross, placed above the meridian sun and inscribed with the following words, "By his conquer." This amazing object in the sky astonished the whole army, as well as the emperor himself, who was yet undetermined in the choice of a religion, but his astonishment was converted into faith by the vision of the ensuing night. Christ appeared before his eyes, and displaying the same celestial sign of the cross, he directed Constantine to frame a similar standard and to march with an assurance of victory against Maxentius and all his enemies. 48. The learned bishop of Caesarea appears to be sensible that the recent discovery of this marvelous anecdote would excite some surprise and distrust among the most pious of his readers. Yet, instead of ascertaining the precise circumstances of time and place, which always serve to detect falsehood or establish truth, 49, instead of collecting and recording the evidence of so many living witnesses who must have been spectators of this stupendous miracle, 50, Eusebius contents himself with alleging a very singular testimony, that of the deceased Constantine, who, many years after the event, in the freedom of conversation, had related to him this extraordinary incident of his own life, and had attested the truth of it Jorian Epirus. The prudence and gratitude of the learned prelate forbade him to suspect the veracity of his victorious master, but he plainly intimates that in a fact of such a nature he should have refused his assent to any meaner authority. This motive of credibility could not survive the power of the Flavian family, and the celestial sign which the infidels might afterwards deride. 51 was disregarded by the Christians of the age which immediately followed the conversion of Constantine. 52. But the Catholic Church, both of the East and of the West, has adopted a prodigy which favors, or seems to favor, the popular worship of the cross. The vision of Constantine maintained an honorable place in the legend of superstition till the bold and sagacious spirit of criticism presumed to depreciate the triumph and to arraign the truth of the first Christian emperor. 5345. Mémoires de l'Académie des Inscriptions, tome. EVPE. 4114-7937 explains, by physical causes, many of the prodigies of antiquity. In resolving, it tries to introduce the celestial cross of Constantine among the solar halos. Bibliothèque, Grayek, Tom, EV, p. 29. Affer, pi it 29, or arises from the inscription, even the most heated or awestruck imagination would hardly discover distinct and legible letters in a solar halo. But the inscription may have been a later embellishment or an interpretation of the meaning which the sign was construed to convey. Compare Iricon, excur in locum Eusebii, and the author's quoted on 46th return Nazarius inter Panagia, vet. 15:15, in 15 OVGs, 57:15 reader, and 47 in reader's appetite has 27 tried in reader, tine first writer Naserit 1. See Cicero de Natura Deorum 22356, Florus 2:12, Valerius Maximus Lic 8 no 1. Yet the most recent of these miracles is omitted and indirectly denied by Livy XLV, I Exelvius, Lic 28, 29, 30. The silence of the same Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history is deeply felt by those advocates for the miracle who are not absolutely callous to 49 return. The narrative of Constantine seems to indicate that he saw the cross in the sky before he passed the Alps against Maxentius. The scene has been fixed by provincial vanity at Treves, Besançon, and C. Tillemont, Hist. des Empereurs, Tom. 4, p. 5073. 50 to return the pious Tillemont, Mem. Eccles, Tom. 7. 1317 rejects with a sigh the useful acts of Artemius, a veteran and a martyr, who attests as an eyewitness to the vision of Constantine. 52 return 95 files of the vision are unable to produce a single testimony from the fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries, who in their voluminous writings repeatedly celebrate the triumph of the Church and of Constantine. As these venerable men had not any dislike to a miracle, we may suspect, and the suspicion is confirmed by the ignorance of Jerome, that they were all unacquainted with the life of Constantine by Eusebius. This tract was recovered by the diligence of those who translated or continued his ecclesiastical history, and who have represented in various colors the vision of the cross. To 53 return, Godefroy was the first who, in the year 1643, Lic 6 PC 16, expressed any doubt of a miracle which had been supported with equal zeal by Cardinal Baronius and the centuriators of Magdeborough. Since that time, many of the Protestant critics have inclined towards doubt and disbelief. The objections are urged with great force by M. Chauffopier, Dictionnaire critique, Tom. EVP 6-11, and in the year 1774, a doctor of Sorbonne, the Abbé du Voisin, published an apology which deserves the praise of learning and moderation. Note: the first excursus of Heinichen, in Vitam Constantini, p. 507, contains a full summary of the opinions and arguments of the later writers who have discussed this interminable subject. As to his conversion, where interest and inclination, state policy, and, if not a sincere conviction of its truth, at least a respect, an esteem, and awe of Christianity, thus coincided, Constantine himself would probably have been unable to trace the actual history of the workings of his own mind, or to assign its real influence to each concurrent motive. The Protestant and philosophic readers of the present age will incline to believe that in the account of his own conversion, Constantine attested a willful falsehood by a solemn and deliberate perjury. They may not hesitate to pronounce that in the choice of a religion his mind was determined only by a sense of interest, and that according to the expression of a profane poet, 54, he used the altars of the church as a convenient footstool to the throne of the empire. A conclusion so harsh and so absolute is not, however, Christianity. In an age of religious fervor, the most artful statesmen are observed to feel some part of the enthusiasm which they inspire, and the most orthodox saints assume the dangerous privilege of defending the cause of truth by the arms of deceit and falsehood. Personal interest is often the standard of our belief, as well as of our practice, and the same motives of temporal advantage which might influence the public conduct and professions of Constantine would insensibly dispose his mind to embrace a religion so propitious to his fame and fortunes. His vanity was gratified by the flattering assurance that he had been chosen by heaven to reign over the earth. Success had justified his divine title to the throne, and that title was founded on the truth of the Christian revelation. As real virtue is sometimes excited by undeserved applause, the specious piety of Constantine, if at first it was only specious, might gradually, by the influence of praise, of habit, and of example, be matured into serious faith and fervent devotion. The bishops and teachers of the new sect, whose dress and manners had not qualified them for the residence of a court, were admitted to the imperial table. They accompanied the monarch in his expeditions, and the ascendant which one of them, an Egyptian or a Spaniard, 55, acquired over his mind, was imputed by the pagans to the effect of magic. 56, Lactantius, who has adorned the precepts of the gospel with the eloquence of Cicero. 57, and Eusebius, who has consecrated the learning and philosophy of the Greeks to the service of religion. 58, were both received into the friendship and familiarity of their sovereign, and those able masters of controversy could patiently watch the soft and yielding moments of persuasion, and dexterously apply the arguments which were the best adapted to his character and understanding. Whatever advantages might be derived from the acquisition of an imperial proselyte, he was distinguished by the splendor of his purple, rather than by the superiority of wisdom or virtue, from the many thousands of his subjects who had embraced the doctrines of Christianity. Nor can it be deemed incredible that the mind of an unlettered soldier should have yielded to the weight of evidence which, in a more enlightened age, has satisfied or subdued the reason of a Grotius, a Pascal, or a Locke. In the midst of the incessant labors of his great office, this soldier employed, or affected to employ, the hours of the night in the diligent study of the Scriptures and the composition of theological discourses, which he afterwards pronounced in the presence of a numerous and applauding audience. In a very long discourse, which is still extant, the royal preacher expatiates on the various proofs of religion. But he dwells with peculiar complacency on the Sibylline verses, 59, and the fourth eclogue of Virgil. 40 years before the birth of Christ, the Mantuan bard, as if inspired by the celestial muse of Isaiah, had celebrated, with all the pomp of oriental metaphor, the return of the Virgin, the fall of the serpent, the approaching birth of a godlike child, the offspring of the great Jupiter, who should expiate the guilt of humankind and govern the peaceful universe with the virtues of his Father, the rise and appearance of a heavenly race, primitive nation throughout the world, and the gradual restoration of the innocence and felicity of the Golden Age. The poet was perhaps unconscious of the secret sense and object of these sublime predictions, which have been so unworthily applied to the infant son of a consul or a triumvir, 61. But if a more splendid and indeed specious interpretation of the fourth eclogue contributed to the conversion of the first Christian emperor, Virgil may deserve to be ranked among the most successful missionaries of the godlike child. 64 return and los Constantine XVI proprolos, j'avant verbères coupont et des idoles, cernés des bruits de leurs templeuses fumants, au Dieu du ciel je prodigue l'encens. Maïs du mes soins pour sa grandeur, supprends mon orange au Mozart, raison pour sa grandeur, supprends moran, je m'as ébrange objet que moi-même, laissant autrement ses pieds du trône et César. L'ambition, la fureur, les délices et toi mes dieux, avoyons mes sacrifices. Lors des chrétiens, le intrigues de rang et mon rang. The poem which contains these lines may be read with pleasure, but cannot be named with decency. 55 return. This favorite was probably the great Ushus, Bishop of Cordova, who preferred the pastoral care of the whole church to the government of a particular diocese. His character is magnificently, though concisely, expressed by Athanasius, Suprom V, 52-4, 56-1. Osius was accused, perhaps unjustly, of retiring from court with a very ample fortune. 56 return C. Eusebius in VT. Constant, Passim and Zosimus L2P, 24. Return 7 return. The Christianity of Lactantius was of a moral rather than of a mysterious cast. Erat paein rudis, says the orthodox bull, disciplinae Christiani et in rhetorica, melius quam in theologia versatus. Defensio fidei nicene sect. 20. 58 return Fabricius, with his usual diligence, has collected a list of between 300 and 400 authors quoted in the evangelical preparation of Eusebius, see Bible, Graeci LVC 4, Tom, 6p 37 56 to 56 to 56 to Constantine 6th age after the deluge by the Erythraean Sibyl, and translated by Cicero into Latin, The initial letters of the 34 Greek verses form this prophetic sentence: Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior of the world. In his paraphrase of Virgil, the emperor has frequently assisted and improved the literal sense of the Latin ex team. See Blondel de Sibyles, LIC 14, 15, 15, 15, 16. 61 Return. In 15 Son return of Pollio, of Julia, of Drusus, of Marcellus, are found to be incompatible with chronology, history, and the good sense of Virgil. 62 Return in C. Luth de Sacra Poesi, Hebreorum Prelect. 21. P289, 2093. In the examination of the fourth eclogue, the respectable Bishop of London has displayed learning, taste, ingenuity, and a temperate enthusiasm, which exalts his fancy without degrading his judgment. 120. Conversion of Constantine. The awful mysteries of the Christian faith and worship are concealed from the eyes of strangers, and even of catechumens, with an affected secrecy, which served to excite their wonder and curiosity. 63. But the severe rules of discipline which the prudence of the bishops had instituted were relaxed by the same prudence in favor of an imperial proselyte, whom it was so important to allure, by every gentle condescension, into the pale of the church, and Constantine was permitted, at least by a tacit dispensation, to enjoy most of the privileges, before he had contracted any of the obligations, of a Christian. Instead of retiring from the congregation, when the voice of the deacon dismissed the profane multitude, he prayed with the faithful, disputed with the bishops, preached on the most sublime and intricate subjects of theology, celebrated with sacred rites the vigil of Easter, and publicly declared himself not only a partaker, but, in some measure, a priest and hierophant of the Christian mysteries. 64. The pride of Constantine might assume, and his services had deserved, some extraordinary distinction, and ill-timed rigor might have blasted the unripened fruits of his conversion. And if the doors of the church had been strictly closed against a prince who had deserted the altars of the gods, the master of the empire would have been left destitute of any form of religious worship. In his last visit to Rome, he piously disclaimed and insulted the superstition of his ancestors by refusing to lead the military procession of the equestrian order and to offer the public vows to the Jupiter of the Capitoline Hill. 65. Many years before his baptism and death, Constantine had proclaimed to the world that neither his person nor his image should evermore be seen within the walls of an idolatrous temple, while he distributed through the provinces a variety of medals and pictures which represented the emperor in an humble and suppliant posture of Christian devotion. 66 to 3 Return. The distinction between the public and the secret parts of divine service, de missia catechumenorum and the missia fidelium, and the mysterious veil which piety or policy had cast over the latter, are very judiciously explained by Thiers, Exposition du Saint Sacrament, Ephesia, 59-91, but as, on this subject, the papists may reasonably be suspected, a Protestant reader will depend with more confidence on the learned Bingham, Antiquities, LXCC 5-64 Return, see Eusebius in Vite. Const. L4C 15-32, and the whole tenor of Constantine's sermon. The faith and devotion of the emperor has furnished Baconics with a specious argument in favor of his early baptism. Note. Compare Heinichen, Excursus 4-5, where these questions are examined with candor and acuteness, and with constant reference to the opinions of more modern writers. M.C. The pride of Constantine, who refused the privileges of a catechumen, cannot easily be explained or excused, but the delay of his baptism may be justified by the maxims and the practice of ID. The sacrament of baptism 67 was regularly administered by the bishop himself, with his assistant clergy, in the cathedral church of the diocese during the 50 days between the solemn festivals of Easter and Pentecost, and this holy term admitted a numerous band of infants and adult persons into the bosom of the church. The discretion of parents often suspended the baptism of their children till they could understand the obligations which they contracted. The severity of ancient bishops exacted from the new converts a novitiate of 2 or 3 years, and the catechumens themselves, from different motives of a temporal or a spiritual nature, were seldom impatient to assume the character of perfect and initiated Christians. The sacrament of baptism was supposed to contain a full and absolute expiation of sin, and the soul was instantly restored to its original purity and entitled to the promise of eternal salvation. Among the proselytes of Christianity, there are many who judged it imprudent to precipitate a salutary rite which could not be repeated, to throw away an inestimable privilege which could never be recovered. By the delay of their baptism, they could venture freely to indulge their passions in the enjoyments of this world, while they still retained in their own hands the means of a sure and easy absolution. 68. The sublime theory of the gospel had made a much fainter impression on the heart than on the understanding of Constantine himself. He pursued the great object of his ambition through the dark and bloody paths of war and policy, and, after the victory, he abandoned himself without moderation to the abuse of his fortune. Instead of asserting his just superiority above the imperfect heroism and profane philosophy of Trajan and the Antonines, the mature age of Constantine forfeited the reputation which he had acquired in his youth. As he gradually advanced in the knowledge of truth, he proportionally declined in the practice of virtue, and the same year of his reign in which he convened the Council of Nice was polluted by the execution, or rather murder, of his eldest son. This date is alone sufficient to refute the ignorant and malicious suggestions of Zosimus 69, who affirms that, after the death of Crispus, the remorse of his father accepted from the ministers of Christianity the expiation which he had vainly solicited from the pagan pontiffs. At the time of the death of Crispus, the emperor could no longer hesitate in the choice of a religion. He could no longer be ignorant that the Church was possessed of an infallible remedy, though he chose to defer the application of it till the approach of death had removed the temptation and danger of a relapse. The bishops whom he summoned in his last illness to the palace of Nicomedia were edified by the fervor with which he requested and received the sacrament of baptism, by the solemn protestation that the remainder of his life should be worthy of a disciple of Christ, and by his humble refusal to wear the imperial purple after he had been clothed in the white garment of a neophyte. The example and reputation of Constantine seemed to countenance the delay of baptism. 70 future tyrants were encouraged to believe that the innocent blood which they might shed in a long reign would instantly be washed away in the waters of regeneration, and the abuse of religion dangerously undermined the foundations of moral virtue. 67. Return. The theory and practice of antiquity with regard to the sacrament of baptism have been copiously explained by Dom Chardon, Hist. des Sacraments, Tom. EP 3 or 5 Domaten de Ritibus, Ecclesia Antiquis, I, and by Bingham in the 10th and 11th books of his Christian Antiquities. One circumstance may be observed in which the modern churches have materially departed from the ancient custom. The sacrament of baptism, even when it was administered to infants, was immediately followed by confirmation and the Holy Communion. The 68. Return. The fathers, who censured this criminal delay, could not deny the certain and victorious efficacy even of a deathbed baptism. The ingenious rhetoric of Chrysostom could find only 3 arguments against these prudent Christians. 1. That we should love and pursue virtue for her own sake and not merely for the reward. 2. That we may be surprised by death without an opportunity of baptism. 3. That although we shall be placed in heaven, we shall only twinkle like little stars when compared to the sons of righteousness who have run their appointed course with labor, with success, and with glory. Kaisos Tom in Epist. Apud Chardon, Hist. des Sacraments Tum. IP 49. I believe that this delay of baptism, though attended with the most pernicious consequences, was never condemned by any general or provincial council, or by any public act or declaration of the Church. The zeal of the bishops was easily kindled on much slighter occasion. Ace note. This passage of Chrysostom, though not in his more forcible manner, is not quite fairly represented. He is stronger in other places, in Act. Home. 23. And Home. I. Compare, likewise, the sermon of Gregory of Nicaea on this subject, and Gregory Nazianzen. After all, to those who believed in the efficacy of baptism, what argument could be more conclusive than the danger of dying without it? Orat. XL. M. 69. Returns Avissimus, L2. P. 204. For this disingenuous falsehood he has deserted Tuifor no Baronius, AD 324, no. 1528, who had occasion to employ the infidel on a particular service against the Arian Eusebius. Note, Haney, in a valuable note on this passage of Zosimus, has shown decisively that this malicious way of accounting for the conversion of Constantine was not an invention of Zosimus. It appears to have been the current calumny eagerly adopted and propagated by the exasperated pagan party. Reitermeter, a later editor of Zosimus, whose notes are retained in the recent edition in the collection of the Byzantine historians, has a disquisition on the passage as candid but not more conclusive than some which have preceded him. M. Return, Eusebius L4c, 61, 62, 63. The Bishop of Caesarea supposes the salvation of Constantine with the most perfect confidence. The gratitude of the Church has exalted the virtues and excused the failings of a generous patron who seated Christianity on the throne of the Roman world, and the Greeks, who celebrate the festival of the imperial saint, seldom mention the name of Constantine without adding the title of equal to the apostles. 71. Such a comparison, if it allude to the character of those divine missionaries, must be imputed to the extravagance of impious flattery. But if the parallel be confined to the extent and number of their evangelic victories, the success of Constantine might perhaps equal that of the apostles themselves. By the edicts of toleration, he removed the temporal disadvantages which had hitherto retarded the progress of Christianity, and its active and numerous ministers received a free permission, a liberal encouragement, to recommend the salutary truths of revelation by every argument which could affect the reason or piety of mankind. The exact balance of the two religions continued but a moment, and the piercing eye of ambition and avarice soon discovered that the profession of Christianity might contribute to the interest of the present as well as of a future life. 72. The hopes of wealth and honors, the example of an emperor, his exhortations, his irresistible smiles, diffused conviction among the venal and obsequious crowds which usually fill the apartments of a palace. The cities which signalized a forward zeal by the voluntary destruction of their temples were distinguished by municipal privileges and rewarded with popular donatives, and the new capital of the East gloried in the singular advantage that Constantinople was never profaned by the worship of idols. 73. As the lower ranks of society are governed by imitation, the conversion of those who possessed any eminence of birth, of power, or of riches was soon followed by dependent multitudes. 74. The salvation of the common people was purchased at an easy rate, if it be true that, in 1 year, 12,000 men were baptized at Rome, besides a proportionable number of women and children, and that a white garment with 20 pieces of gold had been promised by the emperor to every convert. 75. The powerful influence of Constantine was not circumscribed by the narrow limits of his life or of his dominions. The education which he bestowed on his sons and nephews secured to the empire a race of princes, whose faith was still more lively and sincere, as they imbibed in their earliest infancy the spirit, or at least the doctrine, of Christianity. War and commerce had spread the knowledge of the gospel beyond the confines of the Roman provinces, and the barbarians, who had disdained as humble and proscribed sect, soon learned to esteem a religion which had been so lately embraced by the greatest monarch and the most civilized nation of the globe. 76. The Goths and Germans, who enlisted under the standard of Rome, revered the cross which glittered at the head of the legions, and their fierce countrymen received at the same time the lessons of faith and of humanity. The kings of Iberia and Armenia 76 worshipped the God of their protector, and their subjects, who have invariably preserved the name of Christians, with their Roman brethren. The Christians of Persia were suspected, in time of war, of preferring their religion to their country, but as long as peace subsisted between the two empires, the persecuting spirit of the Magi was effectually restrained by the interposition of Constantine. 77. The rays of the gospel illuminated the coast of India, the colonies of Jews who had penetrated into Arabia and Ethiopia. 78 opposed the progress of Christianity, but the labor of the missionaries was in some measure facilitated by a previous knowledge of the Mosaic revelation, and Abyssinia still reveres the memory of Frumentius, 78 who, in the time of Constantine, devoted his life to the conversion of those sequestered regions. Under the reign of his son Constantius, Theophilus, 79, who was himself of Indian extraction, was invested with the double character of ambassador and bishop. He embarked on the Red Sea with 200 horses of the purest breed of Cappadocia, which was sent by the emperor to the prince of the Sabaeans, or Homerites. Theophilus was entrusted with many other useful or curious presents which might raise the admiration and conciliate the friendship of the barbarians, and he successfully employed several years in a pastoral visit to the churches of the torrid zone. AD 71 returned the Citilement, Hist. des Empereurs, Tom, EVP 429. The Greeks, the Russians, and, in the darker ages, the Latins themselves have been desirous of placing Constantine in the catalogue of saints. 72 Return. See the third and fourth books of his life. He was accustomed to say that whether Christ was preached in pretense or in truth, he should still rejoice. Il 3c58, Isilement, immediatilement, hist, des Empereurs, Tom, EVP. C14616 has defended with strength and spirit the virgin purity of Constantinople against some malevolent insinuations of the pagan Zosimus. 74 Return. The author of the Histoire politique et philosophique des deux Indes dont IP9 condemns a law of Constantine which gave freedom to all the slaves who should embrace Christianity. The emperor did indeed publish a law which restrained the Jews from circumcising, perhaps from keeping, any Christian slave. See Euseb. Invite, Constant, LV C27, and Cod. Theod, LV C Tit, X, with Godefroy's commentary, Tom, VP 247. But this imperfect exception related only to the Jews, and the great body of slaves who were the property of Christian or pagan masters could not improve their temporal condition by changing their religion. I am ignorant by what guides the Abbé Raynal was deceived, as the total absence of quotations is the unpardonable blemish of his entertaining history. See Acta Sti Silvestri and Hist. Eccles, Nisfor, Callist, L.V.E. Callist. LVE C34 App Baronium Annal Eccles AD 3024 number 67 74. Such evidence is contemptible enough, but these circumstances are in themselves so probable 30 Fortin has not scrupled to adopt them. 76 Return. The conversion of the barbarians under the reign of Constantine is celebrated by the ecclesiastical historians. See Sederman L2C 6 and Theodoret L1cc 224, but Rufinus, the Latin translator of 4, but Rufinus, the Latin translator Berius, deserves to be considered as an original authority, and from Bacurius, an Iberian prince who was count of the domestics. Father Mamachi has given an ample compilation on the progress of Christianity in the first and second volumes of his great but imperfect work. 76 A Return Chronicles. Iberia, Georgia was converted by the Virgin Nino, who effected an extraordinary cure on the wife of the king Miran. The temple of the god Aramaste, or Armaz, not far from the capital Mskitha, was destroyed, and the cross erected in its place. Lebeau, I-22, with St. Martin's notes. St. Martin has likewise clearly shown St. Martin Ade. To Lebeau, I-291 Armenia was the first Naste, which embraced Christianity, addition to Lebeau, I-76, and Mémoire sur l'Arménie, I-76. Gibbon himself suspected this truth. Instead of maintaining that the conversion of Armenia was not attempted with any degree of success till the scepter was in the hands of an orthodox emperor, I ought to have said that the seeds of the faith were deeply sown during the season of the last and greatest persecution, that many Roman exiles might assist the labors of Gregory, and that the renowned Tiridates, the hero of the East, may dispute with Constantine the honor of being the first sovereign who embraced the Christian religion. Vindication, 77 Return. See in Eusebius in VT. L4C9, the pressing empathetic epistle of Constantine in favor of his Christian brethren of Persia. 78 in Return. See Basnage, Hist. des Juifs, Tom. 7. P82 Tom. 8. The curious diligence of this writer pursues the Jewish exiles to the extremities of the globe. 78 A Return, Abbas Salama, or Freemonatus, is mentioned in the Tarek Negushti, Chronicle of the Kings of Abyssinia. Salt's Travels, Volume 2p. 464. M79 returned to Theophilus had been given in his infancy as a hostage by his countrymen of the Isle of Diva, and was educated by the Romans in learning and piety. The Maldives, of which Mael or Diva may be the capital, are a cluster of 1900 or 2,000-minute islands in the Indian Ocean. The ancients were imperfectly acquainted with the Maldives, but they are described in the two Mahometan travelers of the 9th century, published by Renaudot, Geographe. Nubiensis, p. 31 do Belloc, p. 704. Hist. Generale des Voies Egov. He see the dissertation of M. Letron on this question. He returned to the Prescians to the fourth Philus who's been given in Isiptriot. His embassy was to Abyssinia rather than to India. Letron matériaux pour l'Euchte. du christianisme en Égypte, Indie et Abyssinie, Paris, 1832, 3d Dessor. M. 80. Return. Philostorgius, L3c. 456 with Godefroy's learned observations. The historical narrative is soon lost in an inquiry concerning the seat of paradise, strange monsters, and c. The irresistible power of the Roman emperors was displayed in the important and dangerous change of the national religion. The terrors of a military force silenced the faint and unsupported murmurs of the pagans, and there was reason to expect that the cheerful submission of the Christian clergy, as well as people, would be the result of conscience and gratitude. It was long since established as a fundamental maxim of the Roman constitution that every rank of citizens was alike subject to the laws, and that the care of religion was the right as well as duty of the civil magistrate. Constantine and his successors could not easily persuade themselves that they had forfeited, by their conversion, any branch of the imperial prerogatives, or that they were incapable of giving laws to a religion which they had protected and embraced. The emperors still continued to exercise a supreme jurisdiction over the ecclesiastical order, and the 16th book of the Theodosian Code represents, under a variety of titles, the authority which they assumed in the government of the Catholic Church. But the distinction of the spiritual and temporal powers, 81, which had never been imposed on the free spirit of Greece and Rome, was introduced and confirmed by the legal establishment of Christianity. The office of Supreme Pontiff, which, from the time of Numa to that of Augustus, had always been exercised by one of the most eminent of the senators, was at length united to the imperial dignity. The first magistrate of the state, as often as he was prompted by superstition or policy, performed with his own hands the sacerdotal functions. 82. Nor was there any order of priests, either at Rome or in the provinces, who claimed a more sacred character among men or a more intimate communication with the gods. But in the Christian Church, which entrusts the service of the altar to a perpetual succession of consecrated ministers, the monarch, whose spiritual rank is less honorable than that of the meanest deacon, was seated below the rails of the sanctuary and confounded with the rest of the faithful multitude. 83. The emperor might be saluted as the father of his people, but he owed a filial duty and reverence to the fathers of the church, and the same marks of respect which Constantine had paid to the persons of saints and confessors were soon exacted by the pride of the episcopal order. 84. A secret conflict between the civil and ecclesiastical jurisdictions embarrassed the operation of the Roman government, and a pious emperor was alarmed by the guilt and danger of touching with a profane hand the Ark of the Covenant. The separation of men into the two orders of the clergy and of the laity was indeed familiar to many nations of antiquity, and the priests of India, of Persia, of Assyria, of Judea, of Egypt, and of Gaul derived from a celestial origin the temporal power and possessions which they had acquired. These venerable institutions had gradually assimilated themselves to the manners and government of their respective countries. 85. But the opposition or contempt of the civil power served to cement the discipline of the primitive church. The Christians had been obliged to elect their own magistrates, to raise and distribute a peculiar revenue, and to regulate the internal policy of their republic by a code of laws, which were ratified by the consent of the people and the practice of 300 years. When Constantine embraced the faith of the Christians, he seemed to contract a perpetual alliance with a distinct and independent society, and the privileges granted or confirmed by that emperor or by his successors were accepted, not as the precarious favors of the court, but as the just and inalienable rights of the ecclesiastical order. 81. Return. See the Epistle of Ossius, Appii Athanasium, Vol. I. p. 840. The public remonstrance which Ossius was forced to address to the son contained the same principles of ecclesiastical and civil government which he had secretly instilled into the mind of the father. 82. At return on return. De la Bastille has evidently proved that Augustus and his successors exercised in person all the sacred functions of Pontifex Maximus, of high priest of the Roman Empire. 83. Return. Something of a contrary practice had insensibly prevailed in the Church of Constantinople, but the rigid Ambrose commanded Theodosius to retire below the rails and taught him to know the difference between a king and a priest. See Theodoret, L5c. 1899, 84. Return. 84. Ian de Fotre Maximus, Martin, Bishop of Tours, received the cup from an attendant and gave it to the presbyter, his companion, before he allowed the emperor to drink. The empress waited on Martin at table. Sulpicius Severus in VT c. 23 and Dialogue 2:7. Yeti 4:7-5, usually granted to the former character, may be seen in Bingham's Antiquities L2 cc 9 and VTCC Sileveret. See the haughty ceremonial which Leontius, Bishop of Tripoli, imposed on the empress. Tillemont, Hister Empereur, Tom 4p 754, Patres Apostle, Tom 2 p 179. 85 Return Nistatides of Isis and Osiris informs us that the kings of Egypt who were not already priests were initiated after their election into the sacerdotal order. The Catholic Church was administered by the spiritual and legal jurisdiction of 1,800 bishops, 86 of whom 1,000 were seated in the Greek and 800 in the Latin provinces of the empire. The extent and boundaries of their respective dioceses had been variously and accidentally decided by the zeal and success of the first missionaries, by the wishes of the people, and by the propagation of the gospel. Episcopal churches were closely planted along the banks of the Nile, on the seacoast of Africa, in the proconsular Asia, and through the southern provinces of Isis and Osiris. The bishops of Gaul and Spain, of Thrace and Pontus, reigned over an ample territory and delegated their rural suffragans to execute the subordinate duties of the pastoral office. 87. A Christian diocese might be spread over a province or reduced to a village, but all the bishops possessed an equal and indelible character. They all derived the same powers and privileges from the apostles, from the people, and from the laws. While the civil and military professions were separated by the policy of Constantine, a new and perpetual order of ecclesiastical ministers, always respectable, sometimes dangerous, was established in the church and state. The important review of their station and attributes may be distributed under the following heads. 1. Popular election. 2. Ordination of the clergy. 3. Property. 4. Civil jurisdiction. 5. Sem. Exercise of public oratory. Sev. 86 Return. The numbers are not ascertained by any ancient writer or original catalogue, for the partial lists of the Eastern churches are comparatively modern. The patient diligence of Charles Asto Paulo of Luke Holstentius and of Bingham has laboriously investigated all the episcopal sees of the Catholic Church, which was almost commensurate with the Roman Empire. The 9th book of the Christian Antiquities is a very accurate map of ecclesiastical geography. 87 Return. On the subject of rural bishops or chorepiscopi who voted in synods and conferred the minor orders, see Thomasine, Discipline de l'Église, Tom. IP 447 and C. and Chardon. Hist des Sacraments, Tom. VP 3095 and C. They do not appear till the 4th century, and this equivocal character which had excited the jealousy of the prelates was abolished before the end of the sense. The freedom of election subsisted long after the legal establishment of Christianity, 88, and the subjects of Rome enjoyed in the Church the privilege which they had lost in the Republic, of choosing the magistrates whom they were bound to obey. As soon as a bishop had closed his eyes, the metropolitan issued a commission to one of his suffragans to administer the vacant see and prepare, within a limited time, the future election. The right of voting was vested in the inferior clergy, who were best qualified to judge of the merit of the candidates, in the senators or nobles of the city, all those who were distinguished by their rank or property, and finally in the whole body of the people, who on the appointed day flocked in multitudes from the most remote parts of the diocese, 89, and sometimes silenced by their tumultuous acclamations, the voice of reason and the laws of discipline. These acclamations might accidentally fix on the head of the most deserving competitor of some ancient presbyter, some holy monk, or some layman, conspicuous for his zeal and piety. But the episcopal chair was solicited, especially in the great and opulent cities of the empire, as a temporal rather than as a spiritual dignity. The interested views, the selfish and angry passions, the arts of perfidy and dissimulation, the secret corruption, the open and even bloody violence which had formerly disgraced the freedom of election in the commonwealths of Greece and Rome, too often influenced the choice of the successors of the apostles. While one of the candidates boasted the honors of his family, a second allured his judges by the delicacies of a plentiful table, and a third, more guilty than his rivals, offered to share the plunder of the church among the accomplices of his sacrilegious hopes. 90. The civil as well as ecclesiastical laws attempted to exclude the populace from this solemn and important transaction. The canons of ancient discipline, by requiring several episcopal qualifications of age, station, and see, restrained in some measure the indiscriminate caprice of the electors. The authority of the provincial bishops who were assembled in the vacant church to consecrate the choice of the people was interposed to moderate their passions and to correct their mistakes. The bishops could refuse to ordain an unworthy candidate, and the rage of contending factions sometimes accepted their impartial mediation. The submission or the resistance of the clergy and people on various occasions afforded different precedents, which were insensibly converted into positive laws and provincial customs. 91. But it was everywhere admitted as a fundamental maxim of religious policy that no bishop could be imposed on an orthodox church without the consent of its members. The emperors, as the guardians of the public peace, and as the first citizens of Rome and Constantinople, might effectually declare their wishes in the choice of a primate. But those absolute monarchs respected the freedom of ecclesiastical elections, and while they distributed and resumed the honors of the state and army, they allowed 1,800 perpetual magistrates to receive their important offices from the free suffrages of the people. 92. It was agreeable to the dictates of justice that these magistrates should not desert an honorable station from which they could not be removed, but the wisdom of councils endeavored, without much success, to enforce the residence and to prevent the translation of bishops. The discipline of the West was indeed less relaxed than that of the East, but the same passions which made those regulations necessary rendered them ineffectual. The reproaches which angry prelates have so vehemently urged against each other serve only to expose their common guilt and their mutual indiscretion. 88. Returned Thomasin, Discipline de l'Église, Tom 2, 8 PC. 128 p. 673, 721 has copiously treated of the election of bishops during the 5 first centuries, both in the East and in the West, but he shows a very partial bias in favor of the episcopal aristocracy. Bingham Lefort, see Sacraments 28 in 28. Note, this freedom was extremely limited and soon annihilated. Already from the 3rd century the deacons were no longer nominated by the members of the community but by the bishops, although it appears by the letters of Cyprian that even in his time no priest could be elected without the consent of the community. Ep. 2. 68. That election was far from being altogether free. The bishop proposed to his parishioners the candidate whom he had chosen, and they were permitted to make such objections as might be suggested by his conduct and morals. St. Cyprian, Ep. 230. They lost this last right towards the middle of the 4th century. G. 8-9 return. Incredibilis multitudo non solum exio oppido, oppidusa, sed etiam ex vicinis urbibus ad suffragia ferenda convenerat, oppicia severus in vitidor, set in 3 doc mini, cc3, L90 return. The epistles of Sidonius Apollinaris Iva 25-759 exhibit some of the scandals of the Gallican Church, and Gaul was less polished and less corrupt than the East. In 91 return, a compromise was sometimes introduced by law or by consent. Either the bishops or the people chose one of the 3 candidates who had been named by the other party. All the examples quoted by Thomasin Discipline de l'Église, Tomban Dublin WAs, Tomban W3, C. Vi. p. 7/474 Tomb, appear to be extraordinary acts of power and even of oppression. The confirmation of the Bishop of Alexandria is mentioned by Philostorgius as a more regular proceeding. Hist. Eccles, L2, EE note. The statement of Planck is more consistent with history. From the middle of the 4th century, the bishops of some of the larger churches, particularly those of the imperial residents, were almost always chosen under the influence of the court, and often directly and immediately nominated by the emperor. Planck, Geschichte der Christlich-Kirchlichen Gesellschaft der Verfassung, Volume, IP 2063, M. EC. The bishops alone possessed the faculty of spiritual generation, and this extraordinary privilege might compensate in some degree for the painful celibacy, 93, which was imposed as a virtue, as a duty, and at length as a positive obligation. The religions of antiquity, which established a separate order of priests, dedicated a holy race, a tribe or family, to the perpetual service of the gods. 94. Such institutions were founded for possession. The children of the priests enjoyed, with proud and indolent security, their sacred inheritance, and the fiery spirit of enthusiasm was abated by the cares, the pleasures, and the endearments of domestic life. But the Christian sanctuary was open to every ambitious candidate. who aspire to its heavenly promises or temporal possessions. This office of priests, like that of soldiers or magistrates, was strenuously exercised by those men whose temper and abilities had prompted them to embrace the ecclesiastical profession, or who had been selected by a discerning bishop as the best qualified to promote the glory and interest of the Church. The bishops 95, till the abuse was restrained by the prudence of the laws, might constrain the reluctant and protect the distressed, and the imposition of hands forever bestowed some of the most valuable privileges of civil society. The whole body of the Catholic clergy, more numerous perhaps than the legions, was exempted 95a by the emperors from all service, private or public, all municipal offices, and all personal taxes and contributions which pressed on their fellow citizens with intolerable weight, and the duties of their holy profession were accepted as a full discharge of their obligations to the Republic. 96. Each bishop acquired an absolute and indefeasible right to the perpetual obedience of the clerk whom he ordained. The clergy of each episcopal church, with its dependent parishes, formed a regular and permanent society, and the cathedrals of Constantinople 97 and Carthage 98 maintained their peculiar establishment of 500 ecclesiastical ministers. Their ranks 99 and numbers were insensibly multiplied by the superstition of the times, which introduced into the church the splendid ceremonies of a Jewish or pagan temple, and a long train of priests, deacons, subdeacons, acolythes, exorcists, readers, singers, and doorkeepers contributed in their respective stations to swell the pomp and harmony of religious worship. The clerical name and privileges were extended to many pious fraternities who devoutly supported the ecclesiastical throne. 600 parabolani or adventurers visited the sick at Alexandria, 1100 copiatai in Nichel or grave diggers buried the dead at Constantinople, and the swarms of monks who arose from the Nile overspread and darkened the face of the Christian world. 93. The celibacy of the clergy during the first 5 or 6 centuries is a subject of discipline and indeed of controversy. See in particular Thomasine Discipline de l'Église, 2, 60-69 Naitu, and Bingham's Antiquities L4 C5. By each of these learned but partial critics, one half of the truth is produced and the other is concealed. Note, compare Planck, Vol. IP 348. This century the third 48. This century the third first brought forth the monks or the spirit of monkery, the celibacy of the clergy. Planck likewise observes that from the history of Eusebius alone names of married bishops and presbyters may be adduced by dozens. M. Study 423 Siculus attests and approves the Serps, Hibbs Reibs, and the Idaeans LEP 84 L2P 42, 53 edit. Wesseling. The Magi are described by Ammianus as a very numerous family. Per sicula multa ad praesens una edemque precepte, de praecessi presta hapste decata, dorum cutueti poens detiodo, anaidi free. Eve, but we may infer from the remark of Caesar, VV 13, that in the Celtic hierarchy some room was left for choice and emulation. 95 return. The subject of the vocation, ordination, obedience, and see of the clergy is laboriously discussed by Thomasine Discipline de l'Église, Tom. 2p1, 83, and Bingham in the 4th book of his Antiquities, more especially the 4th, 6th, and 7th chapters. When the brother of St. Jerome was ordained in Cyprus, the deacons forcibly stopped his mouth, lest he should make a solemn protestation, which might invalidate the holy rites. This exemption was very much limited. The municipal offices were of 2 kinds, the one attached to the individual in his character of inhabitant, the other in that of a proprietor. Constantine had exempted ecclesiastics from offices of the first description, cod. Theod. 16:22 leg. 7. They sought also to be exempted from those of the second, munera patrimoniorum. The rich, to obtain this privilege, obtained subordinate situations among the clergy. Constantine published in 320 an edict by which he prohibited the more opulent citizens, decuriones and curiales, from embracing the ecclesiastical profession, and the bishops from admitting new ecclesiastics before a place should be vacant by the death of the occupant, Godefroy ad cod. Theod de 12, ti de decure. Valentinian I, by a rescript still more general, enacted that no rich citizen should obtain a situation in the church, de episc 1, lxvi. He also enacted that ecclesiastics who wished to be exempt from offices which they were bound to discharge as proprietors should be obliged to give up their property to their relations. Cod Theodos L. Te 49g96 Renema, reached the Charter of Immunities, which the clergy obtained from the Christian emperors, is contained in the 16th book of the Theodosian Code, and is illustrated with tolerable candor by the learned Godefroy, whose mind was balanced by the opposite prejudices of a civilian and a Protestant. 97 Return to Justinian, Novelle. Double and 3. 60 presbyters or priests, 100 deacons, 40 deaconesses, 90 subdeacons, 110 readers, 25 chanters, and 100 doorkeepers, in all 525. This moderate number was fixed by the emperor to relieve the distress of the church, which had been involved in debt and usury by the expense of a much higher establishment. 98 Return to Universus Clerus Ecclesiae Carthaginiensis, the Persifitentiate Idiscit Relinti. Vichy 9 p. 75. This remnant of a more prosperous state still subsisted under the oppression of the Vandals. 99 Return. The number of 7 orders has been fixed in the Latin Church, exclusive of the episcopal character. But the 4 inferior ranks, the minor orders, are now reduced to empty and useless titles. 100 Return, Cod, Theodos, L16, Tit. 2, Leg. 42-43. Godefroy's Commentary and the Ecclesiastical History of Alexandria show the danger of these pious institutions which often disturb the peace of that turbulent capital. Chapter 20, Conversion of Constantine. Part 4, 3. The Edict of Milan secured the revenue as well as the peace of the Church. 21. The Christians not only recovered the lands and houses of which they had been stripped by the persecuting laws of Diocletian, but they acquired a perfect title to all the possessions which they ate the Timon. As soon as Christianity became the religion of the emperor and the empire, the national clergy might claim a decent and honorable maintenance, and the payment of an annual tax might have delivered the people from the more oppressive tribute which superstition imposes on her votaries. But as the wants and expenses of the Church increased with her prosperity, the ecclesiastical order was still supported and enriched by the voluntary oblations of the faithful. 8 years after the Edict of Milan, Constantine granted to all his subjects the free and universal permission of bequeathing their fortunes to the Holy Catholic Church. 102 And their devout liberality, which during their lives was checked by luxury or avarice, flowed with a profuse stream at the hour of their death. The wealthy Christians were encouraged by the example of their sovereign. An absolute monarch who is rich without patrimony may be charitable without merit, and Constantine too easily believed that he should purchase the favor of heaven if he maintained the idle at the expense of the industrious, and distributed among the saints the wealth of the republic. The same messenger who carried over to Africa the head of Maxentius might be entrusted with an epistle to Caecilian, bishop of Carthage. The emperor acquaints him that the treasurers of the province are directed to pay into his hands the sum of 3,000 follies, or 18,000 pounds sterling, and to obey his further requisitions for the relief of the churches of Africa, Numidia, and Mauritania. 23. The liberality of Constantine increased in a just proportion to his faith and to his vices. He assigned in each city a regular allowance of corn to supply the fund of ecclesiastical charity, and the persons of both sexes who embraced the monastic life became the peculiar favorites of their sovereign. The Christian temples of Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and See displayed the ostentatious piety of a prince, ambitious in a declining age to equal the perfect labors of antiquity. Nonetheless, the form of these religious edifices was simple and oblong, though they might sometimes swell into the shape of a dome and sometimes branch into the figure of a cross. The timbers were framed for the most part of cedars of Libanus, the roof was covered with tiles, perhaps of gilt brass, and the walls, the columns, the pavement, were encrusted with variegated marbles. The most precious ornaments of gold and silver, of silk and gems, were profusely dedicated to the service of landed, perpetual basis of landed perpetuity. In the space of 2 centuries, from the reign of Constantine to that of Justinian, the 1,800 churches of the empire were enriched by the frequent and unalienable gifts of the prince and people. An annual income of 600 pounds sterling may be reasonably assigned to the bishops, who were placed at an equal distance between riches and poverty, 105. But the standard of their wealth insensibly rose with the dignity and opulence of the cities which they governed. An authentic but imperfect 106 rent roll specifies some houses, shops, gardens, and farms which belong to the three basilicae of Rome, St. Peter, St. Paul, and St. John Lateran, in the provinces of Italy, Africa, and the East. They produce, besides a reserved rent of oil, linen, paper, aromatics, and sea, a clear annual revenue of 22,000 pieces of gold, or £12,000 sterling. In the age of Constantine and Justinian, the bishops no longer possessed, perhaps they no longer deserved, the unsuspecting confidence of their clergy and people. The ecclesiastical revenues of each diocese were divided into 4 parts for the respective uses of the bishop himself, of his inferior clergy, of the poor, and of the public worship, and the abuse of this sacred trust was strictly and repeatedly checked. 27. The patrimony of the Church was still subject to all the public compositions of the state. 28. The clergy of Rome, Alexandria, Thessalonica, and C might solicit and obtain some partial exemptions, but the premature attempt of the Great Council of Rimini, which aspired to universal freedom, was successfully resisted by the son of Constantine. 15. That the Edict of Milan, non hominum singularum, ponentianus 16, such a solemn declaration of the supreme magistrate must have been received in all the tribunals as a maxim of civil law. 82. Return misquis ecclesia, venerabilic concilio, decidans bonorum quod optavit relincere. Cod. Theodos. L16. Tit. 2. Leg. 4. This law was published at Rome, AD 31, at a time when Constantine might foresee the probability of a rupture with the Emperor of the East. 103. Return, Eusebius, Hist, Eccles, Invit, Constantine, LEVC. 28. He repeatedly expatiates on the liberality of the Christian hero, which the bishop himself had an opportunity of Eusebius Hist, Eccleselas Libius, he, Elisax Tridacine, Frusia Sest, who seated and gratified the taste of his master, pronounced in Tinalazax Trida. See Tort, a short account of the architecture and ornaments. He likewise mentions the Church of the Holy Apostles at Constantinople, L4c. See Justinian, Novelle, 23. 3. The revenue of the patriarchs and the most wealthy bishops is not expressed. The highest annual valuation of a bishopric is stated at 30, and the lowest at £2 of gold. The medium might be taken at 16, but these valuations are much below the real value. 26. Return. See Baronius, Annal, Eccles, AD 324, number 58, 65, 70, 71. Every record which comes from the Vatican is justly suspected, yet these rent rolls have an ancient and authentic color, and it is at least evident that if forged, they were forged in a period when fifarms not oaking dom, c. 27, return, c. 27, 1556, 333 4458. The legal division of the ecclesiastical revenue does not appear to have been established in the time of Ambrose and Chrysostom. Simplicius and Gelasius, who were bishops of Rome in the latter part of the 5th century, mention it in their pastoral letters as a general law, which was already confirmed by the custom of Italy. 908 Return. Ambrose, the most strenuous assertor of ecclesiastical privileges, submits without a murmur to the payment of the land tax. Si tributum petit imperator non negamus, agri ecclesiae solvunt tributum solvimus quae Caesari, et quae Caesari Caesari est non negatur. Baronius labors to interpret this tribute as an act of charity rather than of duty, rather than of duty, rather than of duty. Yahi aneli. A3 38:7. But the words, if not the intentions of Ambrose, are more candidly Ecclesi, Tom 668, Dada 9, return. In ariminense syndodo super ecclesiarum et clericorum privilegiis tractatu habito, usque io dispositio pregressa est, uciuca quae viderentur ad ecclesiam pertinere, e publica function cessarent inquietudim desistante, quod nostra videtur dudum sanctiore pulsisse. Cod. Theod. L16. Tit. 2. Leg. 15. Had the Synod of Rimini carried this point, such practical merit might have atoned for some speculative heresies, yv. The Latin clergy who erected their tribunal on the ruins of the civil and common law have modestly accepted, as the gift of Constantine, 110 the independent jurisdiction, which was the fruit of time, of accident, and of their own industry, but the liberality of the Christian emperors had actua quae visra nentor an transinere. Under a despotic government, the bishops alone enjoyed and asserted the inestimable privilege of being tried only by their peers, and even in a capital accusation, a synod of their brethren were the sole judges of their guilt or innocence. Such a tribunal, unless it was inflamed by personal resentment or religious discord, might be favorable or even partial to the sacerdotal order. But Constantine was satisfied, 11-2, that secret impunity would be less pernicious than public scandal, and the Nicene Council was edited by his public declaration that if he surprised a bishop in the act of adultery, he should cast his imperial mantle over the episcopal sinner. 2. The domestic jurisdiction of the bishops was at once a privilege and a restraint of the ecclesiastical order, whose civil causes were decently withdrawn from the cognizance of a secular judge. Their venial offences were not exposed to the shame of a public trial or punishment, and the gentle correction which the tenderness of youth may endure from its parents or instructors was inflicted by the temperate severity of the bishops. But if the clergy were guilty of any crime which could not be sufficiently expiated by their degradation from an honourable and beneficial profession, the Roman magistrate drew the sword of justice, without any regard to ecclesiastical immunities. 3. The arbitration of the bishops was ratified by a positive law, and the judges were instructed to execute without appeal or delay the episcopal decrees, whose validity had hitherto depended on the consent of the parties. The conversion of the magistrates themselves, and of the whole empire, might gradually remove the fears and scruples of the Christians. But they still resorted to the tribunal of the bishops, whose abilities and integrity they esteemed, and the venerable Austin enjoyed the satisfaction of complaining that his spiritual functions were perpetually interrupted by the invidious labor of deciding the claim or the possession of silver and gold, of lands and cattle. 4. The ancient privilege of sanctuary was transferred to the Christian temples and extended by the liberal piety of the younger Theodosius to the precincts of consecrated ground. 7-13. The fugitive and even guilty suppliants were permitted to implore either the justice or the mercy of the deity and his ministers. The rash violence of despotism was suspended by the mild interposition of the Church, and the lives or fortunes of the most eminent subjects might be protected by the mediation of the bishop. 710-2. From Eusebius Invit. 9. We are assured that the episcopal jurisdiction was extended and confirmed by Constantine, but the forgery of a famous edict which was never fairly inserted in the Theodosian Code, see at the end, Tom. Vau p. 33, is demonstrated by Godefroy in the most satisfactory manner. It is strange that M. de Montesquieu, who was a lawyer as well as a philosopher, should allege this edict of Constantine, Esprit des Lois, L. 29. Cau 16, without intimating any suspicion under the leaven and return. The subject of ecclesiastical jurisdiction has been involved in a mist of passion, of prejudice, and of interest. Two of the fairest books which have fallen into my hands are the Institutes of Canon Law by the Abbé de Fleury and the Civil History of Naples by Giannone. Their moderation was the effect of situation as well as of temper. Fleury was a French ecclesiastic who respected the authority of the parliaments. Giannone was an Italian lawyer, who was a lawyer as well as a French's triching the time. And here let me observe that as the general propositions which I advance are the result of many particular and imperfect facts, I must either refer the reader to those modern authors who have expressly treated the subject, or swell these notes' disproportioned size. 11-12 return. Tillemont has collected from Rufinus, Theodoret, and C. the sentiments and language of Constantine. Mem. Eccles Tom. 3p. 7-49, 7-59.11-13 returned. C. Cod. Theod. L9. Tit. 45. Leg. 4. In the works of Fra Paolo. Tom. 4p. 192, and c. There is an excellent discourse on the origin, claims, abuses, and limits of sanctuaries. He justly observes that ancient Greece might perhaps contain 15 or 20 asila or sanctuaries, a number which at present may be found in Italy within the walls of a single city, Vist. The bishop was the perpetual censor of the morals of his people. The discipline of penance was digested into a system of canonical jurisprudence, 114, which accurately defined the duty of private or public confession, the rules of evidence, the degrees of guilt, and the measure of punishment. It was impossible to execute this spiritual censure if the Christian pontiff, who punished the obscure sins of the multitude, respected the conspicuous vices and destructive crimes of the magistrate, but it was impossible to arraign the conduct of the magistrate without controlling the administration of civil government. Some considerations of religion or loyalty or fear protected the sacred persons of the emperors from the zeal or resentment of the bishops, but they boldly censured and excommunicated the subordinate tyrants who were not invested with the majesty of the purple. Censure. Athanasius excommunicated one of the ministers of Egypt, and the interdict which he pronounced of fire and water was solemnly transmitted to the churches of Cappadocia. 1115, under the reign of the younger Theodosius, the polite and eloquent Synesius, one of the descendants of Hercules. 1116 filled the episcopal seat of Ptolemais near the ruins of ancient Cyrene. 1117, and the philosophic bishop supported with dignity the character which he had assumed with reluctance. 1118. He vanquished the monster of Libya, the president Andronicus, who abused the authority of a venal office, invented new modes of rapine and torture, and aggravated the guilt of oppression by that of sacrilege. 1119. After a fruitless attempt to reclaim the haughty magistrate by mild and religious admonition, Synesius proceeds to inflict the last sentence of ecclesiastical justice to the abhorrence of earth and heaven. The impenitent sinners, more cruel than Phalaris or Sennacherib, more destructive than war, pestilence, or a cloud of locusts, are deprived of the name and privileges of Christians, of the participation of the sacraments, and of the hope of paradise. The bishop exhorts the clergy, the magistrates, and the people to renounce all society with the enemies of Christ, to exclude them from their houses and tables, and to refuse them the common offices of life and the decent rites of burial. The Church of Ptolemais, obscure and contemptible as she may appear, addresses this declaration to all her sister churches of the world, and the profane who reject her decrees will be involved in the guilt and punishment of Andronicus and his impious followers. These spiritual terrors were enforced by a dexterous application to the Byzantine court. The trembling president implored the mercy of the Church, and the descendants of Hercules enjoyed the satisfaction of raising a prostrate tyrant from the ground. 121. Such principles and such examples insensibly prepared the triumph of the Roman pontiffs, who have trampled on the necks of kings. 1114. Return. The penitential jurisprudence was continually improved by the canons of the councils, but as many cases were still left to the discretion of the bishops, they occasionally published, after the example of the Roman praetor, the rules of discipline which they proposed to observe. Among the canonical epistles of the 4th century, those of Basil the Great were the most celebrated. They are inserted in the Pandex of Beverage, Tom. EIE p. 4751, and are translated by Schustatten down Honre. EIE 370. N91, who declares that he purposely relates it to convince governed that they were not exempt from a sentence of excommunication. His opinion, even a royal head is not safe from the thunders of the Vatican, and the cardinal shows himself much more consistent than the lawyers and theologians of the Gallican Church. 1116. Return. The long series of his ancestors, as high as Eurysthenes, the first Doric king of Sparta, and the fifth in lineal descent from Hercules, was inscribed in the public registers of Cyrene, a Lacedaemonian colony. Sinis. Epist. Livii. pt. 97 edit. Epitaph. Such a pure and illustrious pedigree of 1700 years without adding the royal ancestors of Hercules cannot be equaled in the history of mankind. The 1117 returned seat of Cyrene, Gtt, Greek. Ptolemais, a new city, 82 miles to the westward of Cyrene, assumed the metropolitan honors of the Pentapolis, or Upper Libya, which were afterwards transferred to Sodrusa. 1118 return. Synesius had previously represented his own disqualifications. He loved profane studies and profane sports. He was incapable of supporting a life of celibacy. He disbelieved the resurrection, and he refused to preach fables to the people unless he might be permitted to philosophize at home. Theophilus, primate of Egypt, who knew his merit, accepted this extraordinary compromise. 1119 return. Promotion of Andronicus was illegal, since he was a native of Berenice in the same province. The instruments of torture are curiously specified. The press that variously pressed on distended the fingers, the feet, the nose, the ears, and the lips of the victims. 220 return to the sentence of excommunication is expressed in a rhetorical style. 2001-23, the method of involving whole families, though somewhat unjust, was improved into national interdicts. 2001, return, not 21, return. 2006, 187, Epist 72, p. 2001, Uthals, Epist 72, p. 2018, 2001 Trex Evans, and the tribunes of the demagogues of Athens, and the tribunes of Rome, or artificial eloquence. The coldest nature is animated, the firmest reason is moved by the rapid communication of the prevailing impulse, and each hearer is affected by his own passions, and by those of the surrounding multitude, had silenced the demagogues of Athens and the tribunes of Rome. The custom of preaching, which seems to constitute a considerable part of Christian devotion, had not been introduced into the temples of antiquity, and the ears of monarchs went till the fall forfame praetor eloquence, till the 4000 Constituo contra 23, 22. The arguments and rhetoric of the tribune were instantly opposed with equal arms by skillful and resolute antagonists, and the cause of truth and reason might derive an accidental support from the conflict of hostile passions. The bishop, or some distinguished presbyter, to whom he cautiously delegated the powers of preaching, harangued, without the danger of interruption or reply, a submissive multitude whose minds had been prepared and subdued by the awful ceremonies of religion. Such was the strict subordination of the Catholic Church that the same concerted sounds might issue at once from 100 pulpits of Italy or Egypt if they were tuned to 23 by the master hand of the Roman or Alexandrian primate. The design of this institution was laudable, but the fruits were not always salutary. The preachers recommended the practice of the social duties, which is painful to the individual and useless to mankind. Their charitable exhortations betrayed a secret wish that the clergy might be permitted to manage the wealth of the faithful for the benefit of the poor. The most sublime representations of the attributes and laws of the deity were sullied by an idle mixture of metaphysical subtleties, puerile rites, and fictitious miracles, and they expatiated with the most fervent zeal on the religious merit of hating the adversaries and obeying the ministers of the Church. When the public peace was distracted by heresy and schism, the sacred orators sounded the trumpet of discord and, perhaps, of sedition. The understandings of their congregations were perplexed by mystery, their passions were inflamed by invectives, and they rushed from the Christian temples of Antioch or Alexandria, prepared either to suffer or to inflict martyrdom. The corruption of taste and language is strongly marked in the vehement declamations of the Latin bishops, but the compositions of Gregory and Chrysostom have been compared with the most splendid models of Attic, or at least of Asiatic, eloquence. 24, 122, return, see Thomasin, Discipline de l'Église, Tom, 2L, 3C, 83, p. Constantine 61-1770, and Bingham, Antiquities, Vol. L. 14, C4p. 688. 71 and preaching was considered as the most important office of the bishop, but this function was sometimes in 23, return 23, return. Queen Elizabeth used this expression and practiced this art whenever she wished to prepossess the minds of her people in favor of any extraordinary measure of government. The hostile effects of this music were apprehended by his son Pulpit, Drum Ecclesiastic, and C. Heylyn's Life of Archbishop Lule, P. Tenon, 53, 12-4 return. Those modest orators acknowledged that, as they were destitute of the gift of miracles, they endeavored to acquire the arts of eloquence. VIF. The representatives of the Christian Republic were regularly assembled in the spring and autumn of each year, and these synods diffused the spirit of ecclesiastical discipline and legislation through the 120 provinces of the Roman world. 25. The archbishop or metropolitan was empowered by the laws to summon the suffragan bishops of his province, to revise their conduct, to vindicate their rights, to declare their faith, and to examine the merits of the candidates who were elected by the clergy and people to supply the vacancies of the episcopal college. The primates of Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and afterwards Constantinople, who exercised a more ample jurisdiction, convened the numerous assembly of their dependent bishops. But the convocation of great and extraordinary synods was the prerogative of the emperor alone. Whenever the emergencies of the church required this decisive measure, he dispatched a peremptory summons to the bishops or the deputies of each province with an order for the use of post horses and a competent allowance for the expenses of their journey. At an early period, when Constantine was the protector rather than the proselyte of Christianity, he referred the African controversy to the Council of Arles, in which the bishops of York, of Treves, of Milan, and of Carthage met as friends and brethren to debate in their native tongue on the common interest of the Latin or Western Church. 11 years afterwards, a more numerous and celebrated assembly was convened at Nice in Bithynia to extinguish by their final sentence the subtle disputes which had arisen in Egypt on the subject of the Trinity. 318 bishops obeyed the summons of their indulgent master. The ecclesiastics of every rank and sect and denomination have been computed at 2,048 persons. 127 the Greeks appeared in person, and the consent of the Latins was expressed by the legates of the Roman pontiff. The session, which lasted about 2 months, was frequently honored by the presence of the emperor. Leaving his guards at the door, he seated himself, with the permission of the council, on a low stool in the midst of the hall. Constantine listened with patience and spoke with modesty, and while he influenced the debates, he humbly professed that he was the minister, not the judge, of the successors of the apostles, who had been established as priests and as gods upon earth. 28. Such profound reverence of an absolute monarch towards a feeble and unarmed assembly of his own subjects can only be compared to the respect with which the Senate had been treated by the Roman princes who adopted the policy of Augustus. Within the space of 50 years, a philosophic spectator of the vicissitudes of human affairs might have contemplated Tacitus in the Senate of Rome and Constantine in the Council of Nice. The fathers of the capital and those of the church had alike degenerated from the virtues of their founders, but as the bishops were more deeply rooted in the public opinion, they sustained their dignity with more decent pride, and sometimes opposed with a manly spirit the wishes of their sovereign. The progress of time and superstition erased the memory of the weakness, the passion, the ignorance which disgraced these ecclesiastical synods, and the Catholic world has unanimously submitted 1/9 to the T9 of the opinion. 1030-25 return, 1055 returned at 3025 35 returns in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th canons has made some fundamental regulations concerning synods, metropolitan and primates. The Nicene canons have been variously tortured according to the interest of the clergy. Thus, Suburbicarian churches assigned by Rufinus to the Bishop of Rome have been made the subject of vehement controversy. See Sermon Opera, Tom. 4, p. 1-238. A26 return. We have only 33 or 47 episcopal subscriptions, but Ado, a writer indeed of small account, reckons 600 bishops in the Council of Arles. Tillemont, Mem, Eccles, Tillemont, Returni 2, 27, A Returni 2, 125, and Besopor 20 Chez, 225, Eccle Pointy. The name of Besho Pointy Vessi, which is given by ecclesiastics with E6 returning to Besho Pointy 5, Returni Ves 5, Returni 5, Re75. Pocock must be extended far beyond the limits of an orthodox or even episcopal ordination. 28 return, see Eusebius, Inviti, Constantine, L3C 6221, Tillemont, Mem, Ecclesiastiques, Tum, 6p 6-9-759, 229 return Siximus igitur visem legum obtinere, quia quatua sanctis conciliis, expositiae sunt act firmatae, praedictarum, enim quatuor synodorum dogmata sicut sanctas scripturas et regula sicut leges observamus. Justinian, Nouvelle, 6x6 tie, Beveridge. P2 remarks that the emperors never made new laws in ecclesiastical matters, and Giannoni observes, in a very different spirit, that they gave a legal sanction to the canons of councils. Historia Civili di Napoli, Tommy Fee, 5060-60, 87-9, edition de Luquez. The author, M. Padali. Dr. Bouchot has discussed, according to the principles of the Gallican Church, the principal questions which relate to the form and constitution of general, national, and provincial councils. The editors, see Preface PXVI, have reason to be proud of this article. Those who consult their immense compilation seldom depart so well satisfied,